So in this video, we're going to start looking at the different types of blood vessels in the body and talking a little bit about their structure and their anatomy. So to kind of get you introduced to this particular topic, I want to start out by mentioning that there are three different blood vessel types in the body. So arteries and capillaries and veins. And we're going to start with the arteries. If you look at the diagram that I have here, I've drawn in kind of my silly representation of a heart, and then we've got an arrow that's moving away from the heart that's color-coded red. And this is representing the arteries. So arteries are blood vessels that take blood away from the heart. In most cases, arteries are carrying highly oxygenated blood, and highly oxygenated blood, as you've learned before, tends to be a bright scarlet color. For that reason, we see arteries color-coded usually as red on diagrams, and that's the color that I'm using here for the arrow. If you look at the list under arteries on this slide, you'll notice that there are three different types of arteries. So elastic arteries are the arteries that are located closest to the heart. The aorta is a good example of an elastic artery. These are arteries that basically have a lot of elastin, so that's a protein that tends to be really stretchy in their walls, and that gives this particular artery type the characteristic of being very, very good at stretching and then recoiling back down. This is important because those arteries that are located closest to the heart are receiving blood from the heart that's under a very high pressure, so they need to be able to stretch when blood is being forced into them from the heart, and then also recoil back down to their normal resting shape and size when the heart isn't contracting. As we move away from the aorta and some of these arteries that are closest to the heart, the arteries start to become a little bit smaller, they start to branch off, and these are known as muscular arteries. So most of the arteries that you're learning in lab are actually muscular arteries. They get this name because they don't have so much of the elastin that makes them very capable of stretching and recoiling like elastic arteries do. However, they tend to have a wall that's really quite muscular. And the reason for this is these arteries need to be able to dilate under certain circumstances to allow blood flow to increase to certain areas. And they also need to be able to constrict to decrease their diameter under certain circumstances in order to decrease blood flow to certain areas. So muscular arteries, because this muscular wall allows them to be able to constrict and to dilate to influence blood flow. The smallest type of artery, if you look down here at our diagram, is represented right here. So this is an arteriole. It's the type of artery that feeds into what's known as a capillary bed. So this little mesh-like or net-like structure that you see down here is a capillary bed. Arterioles really aren't much bigger than capillaries. So you can see one here, and again, that's just our smallest type of artery. So once blood has left an arteriole, it makes its way into a capillary. Capillaries are always arranged in these beds, these mesh-like or net-like structures that are interwoven through tissues. If you look down here at this part of the diagram, we're seeing a capillary actually represented. And one of the things that you'll notice about it is it has a very small diameter. So capillaries really are of the size that they allow a single red blood cell at a time to move through them. So those blood cells are actually moving single file, and even as they're doing so, they're kind of having to twist and contort themselves to make their way through the capillaries themselves. But what I want you to notice for a second about capillaries is if you look at the wall that actually makes up the capillary, it's really, really thin. It's just actually a single layer of cells thick, and those are squamous shaped cells. So those are those really thin cells, and that means that capillaries have really, really thin walls, which is important because this is the area where gas exchange is happening, where nutrient exchange is happening between the blood and the tissues. So having that really thin, one cell layer thick wall is going to allow oxygen to diffuse out of the blood from the capillaries, nutrients to move out of the blood from the capillaries, and it's also going to allow the capillaries to pick up carbon dioxide from the tissues in that area. If you look at the wall of arteries, they're quite a bit thicker. Same thing over here. If you look at the wall of a vein, it's actually composed of several different layers. And because of that, with arteries and with veins, We don't see gas exchange happening. We don't see nutrient exchange happening just because their walls are too thick. So capillaries are the only place where we can see that gas exchange and nutrient exchange happening between the blood and the tissues. If you look at the list over here, I've got 3 different types of capillaries listed. So continuous, fenestrated, and sinusoidal. We find all of these different capillary types in the body, just kind of depending on the needs of that particular area of the body. So what differentiates these capillary types from each other is how permeable their walls are. And that's something that you'll have a chance to learn more about in the reading that you do for this week. So continuous capillaries have walls where the cells are really tightly joined together. There's not open gaps, there's not open spaces. And so what we see with continuous capillaries is they don't tend to be very leaky. Almost anything that has to leave a continuous capillary is going to have to do so by actually diffusing through the cells that make up the capillary itself. And for that reason, we tend to see with continuous capillaries just things that are small and nonpolar and that are capable of diffusing, actually being able to move across those walls. So for the most part, things like carbon dioxide and oxygen. With fenestrated capillaries, we actually have some fenestrations in the wall. So fenestrations is another kind of anatomical term for openings or windows. So these particular capillary types have areas where the cells aren't fused together, where there are actually openings in the wall, and that makes this particular cell type a little bit more leaky. So it's easier for things to get out of the blood, it's easier for things to get into the blood with these fenestrated capillaries. Sinusoidal capillaries are the most leaky type of capillary. So there are actually big gaps in the wall of the capillary of this particular type of blood vessel. And so we find them in areas of the body such as the bone marrow, where blood cells are actually being produced, where we need the blood vessels to be really, really leaky, because the way that the blood cells, once they're produced, actually get into the bloodstream in the bone marrow is through sinusoidal capillaries and the big gaps that they have in their walls. So their gaps are actually large enough that they can allow substances even as big as cells to move across the wall because they're so leaky. If you look at the other side of the capillary bed here, we've got a small little blood vessel. It's a type of vein which is known as a venule. This is the smallest type of vein. So veins are blood vessels that return blood to the heart. I've represented that by using this arrow here that's kind of returning towards the heart. Veins in almost all circumstances, with the exception of one of the veins that we talked about that's bringing blood back to the heart, veins in almost all circumstances are carrying deoxygenated blood. And because of that, we see them color-coded blue, because remember that deoxygenated blood doesn't have as high of an oxygen content, and so it's not that bright red scarlet color that we would typically see with more highly oxygenated blood that's typically found in the arteries. So this is our last slide for this particular lecture, and this just looks at the walls of arteries and veins. So we have talked about the structure of capillaries already. We've talked about the fact that they are made up of a simple squamous epithelium, their wall. So it's really thin, and that allows capillaries to be very good at allowing things to diffuse across them. So oxygen, nutrients, carbon dioxide, in most cases can move across the wall of a capillary very, very rapidly due to the thinness. With the arteries and the veins, I mentioned previously that their walls are quite a bit thicker, and that prevents any gas exchange and any nutrient exchange happening between the arteries and between the veins. So what I want to do with this last slide here is talk about the actual layers that make up the walls of both arteries and veins. And we see a similar structure with the same layers in both arteries and veins. We'll talk about some of the few differences between the two as we look at this particular slide. So arteries and veins are typically made up of 3 layers. The innermost layer is what's known as the tunica intima. And if we go over here to this artist representation of an artery, this is the tunica intima. So it's this innermost layer that's in direct contact with the lumen. The lumen is the area of the blood vessel that's hollow through which blood is moving. So we've got a tunica intima with arteries. If you look over here, we've got a tunica intima with veins as well. So it's that innermost layer that's lining the blood vessel wall that would be in direct contact with the blood cells and with the plasma as it's moving through the vessel. The tunica intima is sometimes composed of a couple of sublayers, but in smaller arteries and smaller veins, it really is just what's known as the endothelium. So we've talked about the endothelium previously. This is a simple squamous epithelium. It lines the lumen. It's really slick, and its job is to reduce friction. So its job is to be a really slick lining to the inside of arteries and veins that reduces friction as the plasma and as the cells of the blood are moving through those arteries and veins. If we can have as friction-free of a system as possible, that's going to really decrease the force or the pressure that the heart has to generate in order to push blood through the 60,000 miles of blood vessels that we all have. So because there's so many miles of blood vessels throughout the body, it really makes sense to line those blood vessels with this really slick lining that's going to decrease resistance and make it easy for the blood to be able to travel through the vessels. Both arteries and veins have a middle layer, so it's represented in kind of this deeper red color that you're seeing here on the artery, which is known as the tunica media. So this is a layer that's composed of smooth muscle. In the elastic arteries, we also see a great amount of that protein elastin being found in this area, which allows those elastic arteries to be able to stretch and recoil. But in most arteries and most veins, this is largely just a layer of smooth muscle. And this layer of smooth muscle allows those arteries and allows those veins to some extent to be able to dilate and to be able to constrict. If you look at the tunica media in a vein, okay, so I'm kind of running my pointer right along it here, you'll notice that it is much, much thinner than what we see in an artery. And there's a reason for this. Arteries are carrying blood that's under a really high pressure. So they need to have walls that are a little bit more stout, that are a little bit stronger. Veins are carrying blood that's under the lowest pressure of any vessel type in the body. The pressure that's in veins is even lower than the pressure that's in capillaries. And so they don't need a wall that's as thick, they don't need a wall that's as strong to be able to handle that. The other reason that we see a much thicker tunica media or a much thicker smooth muscle layer in arteries and a thinner smooth muscle layer in veins is that arteries need to be able to relax, they need to be able to dilate, but they also need to be able to constrict, because remember, one of their jobs is really to influence blood flow to different tissues of the body based on where blood is needed at any given point in time. Veins really are just trying to get the blood back to the heart. We don't really want to impede blood flow back to the heart, and so they don't need to be able to constrict to the same extent that arteries need to. You guys are going to have a chance in lab to look at both arteries and veins under a microscope and see some of the different layers that make up these organs. And one of the things that you'll notice is when you have a vein and you have an artery that's cut in cross-section, the veins will tend to collapse. And this is because their walls are so much thinner and their walls are not as strong. But with an artery, they tend to hold their shape even when they're cut because they've got this much thicker tunica media, a much thicker wall, because they are needing to be able to withstand much higher blood pressures within them. The outermost layer on both arteries and veins is what's known as the tunica externa. So you can see that here on the artery. Just a thick layer there on the outside. We've got the tunica externa over here on the vein as well. And basically, this is just a tissue that's mostly collagen that's going to provide some protection and some support to the outside of the blood vessel. One of the things that I think I've probably said about collagen before is that it's actually stronger than steel of the same size. So when you've got these blood vessels that have this lining of collagen on the outside, that's going to really help to protect and to support and to reinforce those blood vessels.